This is the Anbernic RG34XX SP, and it might be the small clamshell handheld that you have been waiting for, especially if you're a Game Boy Advance fan. So let's dig into that a little bit further. Real quick, just wanted to talk about a brief history of the handheld clamshell retro emulation devices. I think originally we had the Powkitty V90, which at the time was pretty cool. It had a lower resolution screen, I think maybe even 320 by 240 or something like that, in a weaker chip. But that wasn't really the biggest downfall. It was just a bit of a user experience not being great. The worst part about the V90 was there was a power switch on the side, and if you just flipped it off, there's a high chance you just completely corrupted your SD card. They did fix that in a recent-ish release, but probably a little bit too little too late. Still a cool handheld of the time and something that many people still treasure for its time. And then there was quite a large stretch where we had rumors of clamshell handhelds, and we were waiting, and then finally we got this, which is the Anbernic RG35XX SP, the predecessor to the one we are looking at in the video today. This is a solid handheld, great hinge, decent 640 by 480 screen, H700 chipset we've seen in a lot of devices. The original version, like this one, the V1, had a bit clicky buttons, not the worst, but they were a bit on the latter side and a little rattly when you shook it. But overall, this has been a solid choice for a lot of people that enjoy the handheld. Then recently we got the Miu Flip, which I don't have anymore because mine broke and I sold it to somebody for parts that needed the screen out of it. But the Miu Flip, it was nice. It was smaller. It had some decent controls on it. People liked it, but the build quality it really felt like a toy. They just didn't deliver. The hinges, especially on the gray units, were just failing on those. There are parts inside grinding, coming loose, etc. It just didn't feel good. But here with the 34XX SP, I think we finally got kind of a middle point between the 35XX SP and the Miu Flip. This is a little bit smaller than the 35XX SP, a little bit bigger than the Miu Flip, but it's way more sturdy. It's got the H700 chipset, which still has enough power for what we need for the most part. It's got nice controls. They are less clicky than the 35XX SP. Does add joysticks for people that want them. Some people hate that they're there, but honestly, I don't think they really detract. In fact, they don't stick out at all from the device really, so it makes for still a pretty sleek package, even if you don't need the joysticks. Aesthetically, I guess it could ruin it a little bit for some, but I don't really delve that deep into such things, so I think that it is solid. So yeah, I think this is kind of the culmination of the last couple years of clamshell handhelds, at least in this form factor. You know, we've got the Retroid Flip and Flip 2, but that's Android, bigger size, different price point, totally different. We're talking sub-$100 Linux-based firmware emulation handhelds. And I think this might be the one to get as long as the aspect ratio doesn't put you off, and we'll talk about that a little more. Before I get too far into this, let's just take a quick look at the specs of the device and the pricing here. So this does have the H700 chipset, which is the same thing we've seen in at least a dozen other Anbernic handhelds now. We know what it can do, pretty much caps out at some Nintendo 64 at Dreamcast on the high end of the spectrum, but PlayStation 1 below is not going to be a problem. You know, with the sticks here, it's kind of nice that maybe Nintendo 64 might be slightly more enjoyable experience on here than something like the 35XS Gosh, that's a mouthful to say. But yeah, that's what we're going to see performance-wise. I believe this does have 2 GB instead of 1 GB of RAM, some users have noticed. So that might make a difference for Portmaster and things like that. But for the majority of stuff, probably not going to be a huge difference. But yeah, as far as specs go, we've got a 3.4 inch 720 by 480 3:2 aspect ratio screen. And to my understanding, this is a true 3:2 aspect ratio. There was some question about that on the internet. It turned out that somebody just had the wrong impressions based on some stuff, and they admitted that. Not a big deal. Shout out to the Fox for all the amazing works he does, researching and benchmarking handhelds and stuff like that. Everybody's human and they make a mistake sometimes. But yes, we have verified that this is in fact a 720 by 480 screen, even though the glass extends beyond the bezel. It's just hiding the electronics in other parts of the screen. It's not wasted pixels that are being cut off like we saw happen on the original Retroid Pocket Mini. So screen is nice, and it is bright. It is brighter than the 34XS, and we'll talk about that too in a minute. So it is a much better option for outdoor play than just the 34XX, which is the classic Game Boy Advance, original Game Boy Advance style looking device. So yeah, overall, I think the specs are solid on here. They're what we expect for this class. Nothing mind-blowing, but they get the job done. So let's talk about what that costs you. So as the price goes, at least for me here in the US at the time of recording this video, it is $66.99 for the base 64 GB model with no extra second card on it. And it looks like the shipping comes in at just under $20, at least to me here in California. So you're looking at a total of $87.87. So just under $90 for this. That is a little steep compared to the market that's of other devices that are out there and have been out there for a minute, where you might be able to get them closer to $60 or something like that. But it is the latest and greatest, and I'm sure we'll see sales, etc. in the future. So, and maybe that's just the new price of handhelds. A lot of things have gone up in price this year for various reasons I won't get into in this video. But yeah, for under $100, it's still a solid performer. It might be a little higher than I would hope. Maybe we can see these in stock where the shipping isn't quite so expensive. Maybe free shipping on AliExpress on $68, and then it'll be 68 instead of almost 90. And at that price point, I think definitely a easier buy and recommend. But yeah, that's what it costs. So let's dive into a little bit more about this fun little device. So rather than do my typical deep dive and go over every little tiny aspect of this, I wanted to kind of do a bit more of a narrative and look at some other competitors in the space and just give you an idea of why you might want to pick this particular handheld. So the first and most obvious one in the room here is the 35XX SP. So let me get that powered up and we'll skip ahead and take a look at what these look like next to each other. All right, so here we have the 34XX SP and the 35XX SP next to each other. So let's just first start with the physical differences here. As you can see, the 34XX, from now on, I'm just gonna call these the 34 and the 35 because I'm not gonna say all that. The 34 here is a bit shorter overall when open even and just a hair narrower. And let's close those and kind of take a look at that. If you put this on top of the 35, you can see that the 34 is, I don't know, 4-5 millimeters. In fact, I can even take out my calipers if we want to get scientific here. Actually, it's about closer to 7 millimeters narrower, so not insignificant. And then if we look at it from the side view, it is slightly thinner. These dimension differences aren't huge. So let's see, we've got 27.5 on the 35, and we've got 25.5-ish, so about 2 millimeters thinner that way. Height-wise, they are nearly identical. There's not really a huge difference in how tall it is that way. But I will say from being 7 millimeters narrower and 2 millimeters thinner, it does contribute to an overall less chunky feeling device. We've also got slightly more rounded corners on here. In your hand and in your pocket, this just slides in a little bit easier than the 35 does. So originally I thought, oh, it's not that big of a difference. It's almost as big. But actually in practice, it does feel a little more svelte and compact in your pocket or hand. So yeah, kudos to Anbernic for slimming that down a little bit and making it feel just a little bit better when you're carrying it around. So that's the external differences. So let's take a look at the inputs, which is kind of the other major difference aside from the screen here. And the button clickiness was a huge one. People talked about the 35XX version 1 being a little loud. They even did tape mods and stuff. Allegedly, the version 2 helped it a little bit. I've never owned one, but let's just take a quick listen here. So as you can hear, it is a lot quieter. We still get a pretty tactile click here. It still has really good tactility and response. It doesn't feel bad at all, but it's a little bit quieter. So I think overall it's just a straight win. D-pad, similarly, it's a bit quieter. We do have a little bit narrower of a cross than on here. That's kind of maybe just a preference. They're both totally fine and similar in their activation, so they're good. Then of course we've got the joysticks on here, which are small, but surprisingly not that bad to use because they have a kind of a grippy top and they're recessed. It's easy enough, and they do have an L3 and an R3 click on them. They aren't Pure Vita style joysticks. And then of course, as I mentioned earlier, briefly, they barely stick out at all, so they really don't intrude with handling of the device, especially if you're only playing games with the D-pad and face buttons and no joysticks, which is probably most of what you're going to be playing on the system. Other major thing is the brightness on this. So originally I had the 34XX and I reviewed that and said that the brightness was disappointing. You couldn't see it outside. I was fully prepared for this to be the same, seeing as I thought it would have the same screen, same resolution and size, but it appears that either they've changed some settings or maybe they're using a different backlight on this panel, but I am happy to report that this is much brighter. So one comparison, the Trim UI brick has a pretty good brightness outdoors. So I wanted to kind of compare and see how the 3.4 does now with the updated screen. So right now I'm going to put a picture on screen and it's going to show that off. So, okay, here you're looking at an outdoor scenario. I was out at the park. The kid was on the playground, was just kind of hanging out. And so I brought these both up, looked at them, and I will say the Trim UI brick might be just a hair brighter, but the 34XX SP holds up. And so in the shade, totally fine to play. In direct sunlight's gonna be a little hard to see, but that is honestly a lot of handhelds unless they have super bright AMOLED screens or something like that on them. But yeah, totally passable. So cool. It's one of the last things I kind of want to talk about on the review here today was just how content displays on the screen and its size. So first thing up, the system that it's meant for, Game Boy Advance, it's good because we have the correct aspect ratio on here and we're not wasting any screen real estate. So here I've got three handhelds. I've got the 35XX SP, which has 3.5 inch 4:3 screen. On the 3.4, we have the 3.4 inch 3.2 screen. And on the Trim UI brick, we have a 3.2 inch 4:3 screen that has a nice and crispy 1024 by 768 resolution. Looks a little bit out of focus in the shot just because the camera depth of field, I can lift it up there. But here's kind of a size comparison of what Game Boy Advance looks like. So first up, let's look at the two SPs side by side. We'll get those up nice and close and crispy to the screen here. And you can see that the content is near identical in size for Game Boy Advance. We basically have the same width screen. It's just a little bit shorter on the 34XX SP. You can also see here one difference is that on the 3.5, that Game Boy Advance SP logo, that's actually a trick. That's on the screen. That is not a logo. So they do a good job by default of kind of hiding that screen difference by putting the logo there. So that actually looks kind of cool in some ways. Maybe you get a decal to put on the 3.4 or something like that. But yeah, about the same content size. Now, if you wanted to just have a vertical handheld that was smaller, the Trim UI brick is still one of my favorites. And it's 4:3, but it's that smaller size. So as you can see here, we do lose real estate on the Game Boy Advance games. They are a decent amount smaller, though not terrible, but that's not really where this is going to shine. So next up, I wanted to show something that is in the 4:3 aspect realm of content, because that's going to give us a better idea of maybe the shortcomings of the 34XX SP when displaying retro games. So let's get that pulled up here. Okay, so real quick, first thing you might notice here, there are some pre-configured bezels and they use kind of this little CRT overlay. Maybe that's integer scaling on, but I'm just going to go ahead and configure this to be a 4:3 with no overlay so that we're getting a closer experience across the three devices. Okay, so now that I've got these all set up and running, let's take a quick look here. The 3.4 versus the 3.5. You can see that 3.5 gives you a bit bigger image. Maybe this wasn't the best game to check, but you can see here there's a few millimeters more width there and a little bit more height as well. So you are going to get a smaller image. It's not necessarily the most ideal, but you should have pretty much the same integer scaling options because these screens are both 480 pixels high. So this has more horizontal pixels, but that wouldn't affect the integer scaling really at all. If anything, if you wanted to integer scale, overscale a little bit on some systems, you'll only lose a little on the top and bottom and not on the sides. So not a deal breaker, but yeah, it is a bit smaller. So then if it's already going to be smaller, the question is, would just something with a smaller 3.4 screen work just as well? And the answer there is pretty much, yeah, these are nearly identical in the size of the content. So the brick versus the 34XX SP, if you're playing 4.3 or taller, maybe 8.7 content, or even closer to 1.1 like Game Boy stuff, that stuff is going to look pretty much the same on both of these because you have about the same vertical height. So now, as far as which is smaller, well, in this case, yes, this is taller, but it is narrower and it is thinner. So both of these can fit in your pocket pretty much equally well. Of course, the beauty of the clamshell is that the screen and everything's protected where it's not on this and you might want a case. So I guess in that case, the flip wins. But I think you can't really go wrong with either of these for a compact everyday carry. But we're not here to talk about the brick mostly here today. We're talking about the 34XX SP. Man, I'm really tired of saying that. And it's pretty awesome. I don't think that the smaller size on some of the content is much of a detractor. I think I would still rather carry this in my pocket every day than the 3.5 just because it is smaller and the buttons are a little bit quieter. These are just small quality of life things for me, and we still get a screen that is bright enough for everyday carry use. So this really is an excellent everyday carry handheld. So just to kind of summarize everything that we've talked about already, the high points are the buttons are great, the input is great, everything that has to do with Game Boy Advance is going to be great on this because it's going to look just awesome. In fact, let me pull up Game Boy. Let's play Game Boy while we're talking about Game Boy. It is a refinement of the 35XX SP. It's got a pretty bright screen for everyday carry. It's pocketable. It feels sturdy enough. There's no rattle. There's no risk of this screen flopping all over the place. It is all over a good experience. And then as far as low points, I guess it's just really, there's not a lot that I have to find about this other than for stuff that's not Game Boy Advance, the screen is going to be smaller, but I still think that the overall size kind of negates that as a con. So yeah, it is really fun to play on. It might be the umpteenth H700 device. Maybe you're tired of Anbernic putting stuff out, but you know what? I guess it's kind of cool that we're spoiled for choice like this, that you can have something for every option. If you are a Game Boy Advance nostalgia, you had an SP, Game Boy when you were a kid or a teenager or even adult, this really harkens back to that and kind of has the perfect screen for that content and is really fun to play that stuff on here. So it's done well. It's the umpteenth H700 device, but it's also a good H700 device. Oh, quick disclaimer, I forgot to mention it earlier in the review, my bad. This was sent to me by Anbernic for review. Seems like I'm giving this a glowing review, and it's not because Anbernic gave it to me. It's honestly because I do enjoy playing this handheld. I'm not afraid to say bad things about the handhelds if I don't like them. I mentioned how the ergonomics and the screen brightness weren't that great on the 34XX. I'm not against criticizing Anbernic, and sometimes their buttons could be a little loud, but in this case, I think that it really is good and worthy of the praise. They're not seeing this video or having any say in what I say about it. So yeah, let me keep the review compact this time. We're not going to go any farther on it other than it just really feels like a great package for a clamshell and a pocketable device. If you want a clamshell, I can 100% recommend that you buy this over the Miu Flip and probably also over the 35XX SP unless you specifically want that slightly larger screen for the content that is a different aspect ratio. So yeah, I think this really is the Game Boy Advance clamshell that you've been waiting for. Pretty awesome. That's all I got for today. Have a good one.